The year 2023 marks 20 years since the invasion of Iraq. It's likely we're talking about the war that marked the adolescence of all the people between 30 and 40 years old who watch this channel. I'm sure many of you still have in your mind images that are already part of history, images as famous as this one. Now, I'm sure many of you also remember the big demonstrations and protests against the war, and this is an interesting thing, because this war took place at about the same time as the Afghanistan war. However, the military intervention in Afghanistan got much better press. Everyone understood that it was an appropriate response to the 9/11 attacks. In contrast, the Iraq War was highly controversial. For 2 to 3 years, pop culture was soaked in the war. Artists like Madonna and big Hollywood stars like Tim Robbins and Kim Basinger spoke out against the US invasion of Iraq. No blood for oil was the slogan of mass anti-war protests that were held around the world. Well, curiously enough, no one doubts 20 years on that the war in Afghanistan was a total failure that has ended with the Taliban back in power after a rather embarrassing evacuation of Western forces. Meanwhile, about 2,500 US troops remain in Iraq today. What's more, all indications are that there is no hurry for them to leave.
Iraqi Prime Minister supports indefinite US troop presence.
That means a US soldier cannot enter Afghanistan even if he or she wanted to, while at the same time in Iraq, they are almost welcome. Well, not quite, but you get my point. So the question is, why did the Iraq War happen? To what extent was it a failure? What is Iraq like right now? On VisualPolitik today, we are going to answer all these questions, but first, let's take a little look at a bit of history. Listen up.
The bad guy in the movie.
There was a time back in the 1990s when the Soviet Union was already less scary than the X-Files, and the Chinese threat seemed more like a challenge at an all-you-can-eat Asian restaurant. So for many years, Saddam Hussein was the icon of evil. In South Park, he was more evil than the devil himself. He was so bad that in the war that pitted Iraq against Iran in the 1980s, the White House ended up supporting the Ayatollahs regime, perhaps to ensure that no one would win and both sides would lose. In the mid-1980s, the Iran-Contra scandal broke out. President Ronald Reagan's administration was secretly selling arms to Iran, a country under a US arms embargo. With the money obtained, the White House was financing the Contras, an armed group fighting to overthrow the Nicaraguan government that had emerged from the Sandinista revolution. Both operations, the sale of arms to Iran and the financing of the Contras, were prohibited by the US Senate. The fact is that peace between Iraq and Iran did not come until 1988, and not surprisingly, neither side won. The borders remained in the same place they had been before the war. Of course, almost 1 million people lost their lives along the way, and after 8 years of destruction, the economies of both countries were also destroyed. When the war ended, Kuwait, which was a petro-monarchy allied with Saddam Hussein, began to reclaim the money from Iraq that it had lent to fight the Ayatollahs. We're talking about no less than $14 billion. So the relationship between the two countries began to go awry, to the point that Iraq accused Kuwait of stealing its oil through the use of advanced techniques in border oil fields. It was a baseless accusation, but Saddam's regime was preparing the ground to invade Kuwait, which it did in August 1990, provoking a unanimous rejection by the international community. For 5 months, diplomacy tried to get Saddam Hussein to withdraw his troops from Kuwait. The UN Security Council passed 5 resolutions to this effect. Finally, on 16th January 1991, an international coalition of 34 countries, led by the United States and mandated by the UN, launched a military campaign to force the invading army to withdraw from Kuwait. UN Resolution 660, which supported this operation, was unanimously approved. And so began the Gulf War, the first in history to be televised live. Operation Desert Storm lasted 6 weeks and was a great success. Come on, it was so fierce that the US could have easily overthrown Saddam Hussein. General Norman Schwarzkopf, in charge of the military operation, says he asked President Bush Sr. for 1 more week to finish off Saddam, but the White House refused. In an interview for PBS's Frontline, Schwarzkopf gives details of why they didn't topple Saddam in 1991. Check it out.
I would have loved to have gone to Baghdad and grabbed Saddam Hussein, but this was not an emotional decision, it was a strategic decision. And strategically, we were smart enough to win the war and win the peace. If Saddam were to be replaced tomorrow, he would probably be replaced with someone who's just as bad or worse than he is. General Norman Schwarzkopf.
Possibly the younger amongst you will be thinking, okay, it's clear to me that at the end of the last century, Saddam Hussein was the bad guy in the movie. But what did he do to become such a villain? Many of you will even be wondering, hang on Josh, if he was so bad, why wasn't he overthrown in 1991? Well, his story began in the 60s, in an era rife with coups d'etat in Iraq, where Saddam Hussein's position improved so much that he went from exile to the vice presidency of the republic, thanks to his leadership of the Arab Socialist Ba'ath Party. Arab socialism was a very popular ideological trend in the mid-20th century. It involves a mixture of three crucial elements: socialism, with a centralized state-run economy; secularism, as they are against putting religious leadership above political leadership; and militarism, with a prominent role for the armed forces in the organization of the state. Arab socialism evolved. It began as Pan-Arabism, with the aim of uniting all Arabs in a single homeland, since they considered the existing borders to be artificial. But in the end, the clashes between the Ba'athist leaders of the various countries led to the emergence of nationalist branches of the Ba'ath. Thus, Saddam Hussein was able to reject any interference, and in 1979, he formally became the president of Iraq. He ruled with an iron fist, surrounding himself with an elite who, like him, were Sunni, a religious minority that barely constituted 1/5 of the Iraqi population. Then, Saddam invested the money generated by the oil industry in the army. He turned it into the 4th largest army on the planet, which is not bad for a country that at the time had only 18 million inhabitants. And up until this point, many of you may be thinking, well, he just sounds like a regular textbook dictator. Okay, that's true, but it's not only that Saddam oppressed his own people, it is that he even killed them with chemical weapons. Yeah, that's what I said. In the 1980s, Saddam Hussein committed a series of massacres against the Kurdish population of northern Iraq, Operation Anfal, which resulted in the destruction of 4,500 villages and the murder of some 180,000 civilians, has been described by several countries as a genocide. Episodes such as the massacre of Halabja, a city that was bombed with chemical weapons, causing 5,000 deaths in just one night, are part of the darkest history of humanity. Now, let's not be naive either. This is probably not the reason why the West reacted so strongly against the invasion of Kuwait. Another good reason is in the dinosaur juice. Iraq is a rich country in the Arab world, producing significant amounts of oil and gas. And along with Kuwait, its power would have been excessive. Keep in mind that we're talking about a time when fracking had not yet arrived. Middle East oil was also essential for the United States. However, at the same time, and for the same reason, Iraq needed to continue pumping crude oil to keep prices stable on international markets. And do you know what? This may go a long way toward explaining why the US did not want to end Saddam's regime. Yes, he was an abhorrent dictator, but he had the country under control and needed to sell oil to keep funding the military. So then began the carrot and stick game. If you get too big for your boots, we'll give you a tap and threaten to invade. If you behave, we'll leave you alone, because that way Iraq remains stable. However, this policy changed in 2003. Why? Well, listen up.
No blood for oil.
The 9/11 attacks shocked the great American superpower. The United States had been attacked on home soil by Al-Qaeda, and President Bush had launched a war on terror. This led to the invasion of Afghanistan, where the Taliban regime was harboring Osama bin Laden. The Al-Qaeda leader managed to slip away from US forces. So the White House began to look everywhere for enemies who may be lending him a hand. And not surprisingly, Saddam Hussein's track record didn't help. Of course, time has shown that the links between Al-Qaeda and Saddam Hussein were false. But the fact that both hated the United States was enough for the Bush administration. The US government thus succeeded in getting the UN Security Council to pass Resolution 1441, a resolution in which the international community urged Iraq to cooperate with the disarmament inspectors. But Washington wanted more. It pressed for an ultimatum to be given to Saddam Hussein. However, VisualPolitik viewers, this ultimatum timed out, and in March 2003, the White House decided to go to war on its own. Up until the very last moment, Bush tried to convince the world of the danger of inaction.
Intelligence gathered by this and other governments leaves no doubt that the Iraqi regime continues to possess and conceal some of the most lethal weapons ever devised.
Indeed, the official reason for invading Iraq was that Saddam Hussein was hiding the infamous weapons of mass destruction. There were doubts, and a significant part of the international community opposed the intervention. But despite this, in October 2002, US Congress authorized to attack Iraq if diplomacy failed. In fact, President Bush had broad support from Democratic Party senators, such as, for example, Joseph Biden, the current president of the United States.
This is not a blank check for the use of force against Iraq for any reason. It is an authorization for the use of force, if necessary, to compel Iraq to disarm, as it promised after the Gulf War.
However, unlike the Gulf War, this time there was no large international coalition to fight Saddam Hussein. Only the United Kingdom sent a strong contingent of troops, while European governments were divided between those against the war, such as France and Germany, and those supporting the intervention, such as Spain, Italy, and much of Eastern Europe. The fact is that, perhaps because of this division, the invasion caused great controversy, and there were massive protests all over the world. Nobody understood why Iraq had to be invaded, and artists and intellectuals led international popular movements such as No to War or No Blood for Oil. But in spite of everything, the invasion was a great military success. The US Army conquered Baghdad in just 3 weeks, and just 6 weeks after the war began, President Bush announced the end of major military operations in Iraq. He did so under a large sign that read, "Mission accomplished," something that was highly criticized with the passage of time, in view of the fact that the country was still far from being pacified. In addition, in this speech, Bush set a new goal: to achieve a democratic Iraq.
The transition from dictatorship to democracy will take time, but it is worth every effort. Our coalition will stay until our work is done, and then we will leave. And we will leave behind a free Iraq.
Baghdad had been conquered, and the great statue of Saddam Hussein had been toppled. The Iraqi army had been crushed. However, there were still many loose ends. The most important one was that the dictator had not yet been captured. His palace had been taken, but there was no trace of him, his money, or his alleged weapons of mass destruction. It took half a year before Saddam was finally found hiding in a hole in the ground. He was handed over to the new Iraqi authorities, and the trial against him was ended in the only possible way. He was sentenced to death by hanging. And here it's important to note that Saddam Hussein was defiant to the end. This is how he reacted to his sentence.
بالإعدام شنقا حتى الموت لارتكاب قتل عمد كجريمة ضد الإنسانية وفق المادة 12 أولاً أليف بدلالة المادة 12 أولاً ثانياً ثالثاً رابعاً.
In theory, the Iraq War was a great success for the United States. It had reaffirmed its power as the great military superpower of the moment, and they had every reason to be satisfied. But of course, this was only the first step in the goal of making Iraq democratic. Now comes the big dilemma. Can you really build a state from the outside? Let's take a look.
Is it possible to impose democracy?
Many people think that Bush was deluded because he thought he could impose democracy on a country by military means. The idea seemed to be that since Saddam Hussein had subjected Iraq to a criminal dictatorship, the White House must have imagined that everyone in Iraq was just waiting for the Marines to arrive, save them from the tyrant, and then everyone would live happily ever after. The problem is that the next day, you have to start building a state that, among other things, is completely destroyed. But let's say one thing clearly. This idea of coming into a devastated country and setting up a democracy is something that had already worked in Germany and Japan. Even in South Korea, Germany and Japanese democracy came out of World War II several years later. The United States was instrumental in making that happen, and out of the Korean War came South Korea. It is true that during the first decades, it went through an authoritarian system and a military dictatorship, but with US support, it eventually became a thriving democracy. However, going back to Iraq and Afghanistan, everything seems more complicated. In 2021, the United States ended the Afghan war, and you all saw the disaster that was. Afghan democracy succumbed to the Taliban. In Iraq, things have been different. Obama announced the total withdrawal of US troops in 2011. But the enemies of the young Iraqi democracy were so strong that they demanded the return of Uncle Sam just 3 years later.
US deploying new force to Iraq to boost fight against Islamic State.
The United States made many mistakes in Iraq. It bet on leaders who promoted sectarian and ethnic divisions as a way to win support, politicians who governed for their own rather than the national interest. And so it was very difficult to build a new state for all Iraqis. Another mistake was to disband the army. This decision encouraged Saddam's former troops to nurture a budding insurgency in multiple armed groups determined to fight against the invader, an insurgency as difficult to fight as it was to defeat. However, the reality is that there have been significant changes in Iraq. Free elections have been held since 2005, and within the weakness of the young Iraqi institutions, it could be said that 20 years after Saddam Hussein, there is a functioning democracy in Iraq, where power is transferred relatively peacefully and there is increasing security in the streets. Even oil production gives us a good indication as to how an Iraq that is currently OPEC's second largest producer with more than 4 million barrels per day has been evolving. Now, we're not going to say that everything is going great in Iraq and that Baghdad has turned into Las Vegas. One problem of Iraqi democracy, which also occurred in Afghanistan, is the astronomical corruption. From looting in the streets to looting the public treasury in a way that makes Saddam's gold-plated AK-47 look modest. But we'll talk about Iraq's current problems in a future video. The final reflection is that George Bush did it. Iraq was indeed transformed into a democracy, but at a prohibitive price. Many lives were lost along the way. He also had to throw a lot of money at the problem. Because the United States spent a huge amount of money on this war, $800 billion according to the most conservative estimates, and trillions of dollars according to the other, more generous ones. And so all that, contrary to what many people thought, Baghdad ends up being governed by the thing furthest from what we can consider a Washington puppet. In a democracy, the majority rules, and in Iraq, the majority of the population is Shiite. Therefore, today, the Shiite factions that have received the most support from Iran, the great power of Shiite Islam, and today, one of Washington's greatest arch-enemies, are governing Iraq. The biggest mistake of the invasion was not having a plan for the future of Iraq after the war. Iraq is a democracy. Yes, but it is now a democracy under the influence of Iran, undoubtedly the biggest winner of the Iraq war in the region. The greatest illustration that the US strategy has not exactly been brilliant. But hey, now it is your turn. 20 years after the war, do you think it was a wise decision to invade Iraq? Going back to Bush's words, was it worth the effort to transform Iraq into a democracy? Leave us your answers in the comments. If you found the video interesting, please give it a like, and don't forget to subscribe to VisualPolitik. All the best, I'll see you next time.